صباح الخير للجميع. بالحقيقة
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much. In reality, I'm
عانيت وأنا في حياتي وبنفس الوقت
here feeling a bit of pain because I'm going to be talking about something that it is very moving, and also because I want to send out a message from the children in Iraq, the one of Nineveh, Mosul, and the villages, and in special all the areas in Iraq where people is suffering the terror of the Islamic State, or what we call Daesh. As I say, or as you say, I'm a person who's also suffered in my life, and that helped me to mature at a very small age when I was very, very young, and I understand Christian faith. Christian faith had allowed me to have a special way of feeling others people's suffering. But it is true that we're facing many challenges in the Middle East. We are surrounded by countries that are very much radicalized. They are very fanatic, and we see the Islamic fanaticism. I'm not afraid of declaring and stating that I'm a Christian, but before anything else, I'm a human being, and I can challenge other people, even though they are violent, but I'm going to do it showing my goodness and with the cross that represents me as a Christian. And through my personal suffering, I have tried before becoming a priest, after or before being ordained, I wanted to gain greater knowledge of the Christian faith, and that's why I was studying a lot, because I wanted to understand what it means to be a Christian and why Christians feel this type of pain. And this is something that I've seen very clearly when Jesus Christ said while being in the cross, "Forgive them because they do not know what they're doing." Yesterday we saw the video that was displayed, and it presented the visit to Iraq and them meeting the children. And I remember some of the scenes of the video with that older person who was my teacher, who was showing me the story of Islam, and he did so with greatness and being very good, and he showed us the Lord's Prayer, and that scene brought back to me many memories that hurt me in my soul. By despite that, we are very hopeful. We suffer, but we want to rebuild the situation. We want to rebuild the villages where we used to live, and I'm going to try to express in a few words my testimony. Being a Christian in Iraq, I was in Iraq on a special visit, and there I was asked to provide my testimony. But I want this testimony to be a very constructive testimony, not aiming only at criticizing and reporting things, but aiming at building the future in a more open-minded way. So I'm going to try to read what I wrote in my last visit to Iraq. You know that Iraq is a land that it is very rich and wealthy. We are fortunate enough to have many raw materials, crude oil, and other things that are highly valued. Also, Iraq is in an area that, geopolitically speaking, is very sensitive. So every once in a while, we suffer violence in a systematic way or in a chaotic way, and that push many citizens to, or move many citizens to leave the country, to flee the country, and to look for other destinations abroad, looking for a safer life, although they continue thinking about returning to Iraq. And what they dream about through their memory, their painful memories, gives them the feeling of certain despair because they are seeing that time flies and they are not capable of returning, taking into consideration that the opportunity of living abroad are much better than the opportunities that they will be able to find nowadays on their home villages, on their villages in Iraq. Then that obliges us to think about the governments of those areas and why they don't give them the right to lead a decent life. And I wanted to ask a few questions here. Is it possible for us to think about opportunities to achieving peace in an area that it is fully fragmented and is totally destroyed by radicalism, Islamic radicalism? Can we go back to normal, taking into consideration that the victims today are people that were always faithful to society, that they were people that were doing a lot in order to achieve a good development in their country, and we're all thinking, how can we use democracy if people is not capable of living in peace and with security and with a peaceful coexistence governed by laws that discriminate human beings? What is the use of freedom that it is mentioned so often nowadays if freedom is granted only to a few privileged people when most of the population is deprived from their rights? And my questions are questions that are not my questions, but the questions that all the youngsters that I've had the opportunity to meet formulate. And many of them ask, what do we do with that freedom if that freedom is being used now to oppress some of the citizens? And why, if I stay in my country and if I don't try to run away and be an exile, will anyone be able to guarantee a safe life to me here in Iraq? Who will guarantee rights for children? Who will provide for them? Who will give them health care, education? Who will guarantee that they will end up having a job? There are many questions that we ask ourselves, but we find no answers for them. And unless we can find an answer for them, we will continue on feeling lost in the midst of these dilemmas. I don't want to talk about the history of Christendom in Europe and in the Middle East because everyone knows about it, but I just want to mention the Christian civilization and its contribution to literature, to philosophy, to art for many centuries. So we have to focus ourselves in something that it is very relevant, very vital, is to raise the awareness about the need to peacefully coexist with others, others that are different from us, others that do not profess the same faith. And more important than that, and I would like to highlight this here, we need to activate to build a new generation whose education is based on peaceful coexistence, not paying attention at the differences that we have in the Middle East in terms of religion, for example. As a man who professed the Christian faith as an Iraqian, if we want to maintain our presence, the Christians' presence in Iraq, more specifically on the plains of Nineveh, in Barata, in Karakosh, in all the Christian villages in the Kurdistan, in the north of Iraq, or in other areas, we need to have a clear vision And we need to know what are the problems that Christians face in their life, in their public and in their private life. We need to know about our persecution that we're suffering, how we're being blackmailed, cases in which we are being kidnapped, and we need to disseminate what's going on in the country, and we need to tackle all of these topics. And let me say again that in Iraq, there are many raw materials and there are many different mentalities, and many people, many of the intelligent people in Iraq have fled the country. We wish they were inside in order to find some solutions. But before thinking about a future project, we need to build a new generation, because otherwise we're heading nowhere. Of course, you know that the majority of the Iraqi people are children and youngsters. You've seen that on the videos that have been shown here, because the life expectancy right now in Iraq is not greater than 67 years old for many different circumstances and for many reasons, amongst them the weapons used in Iraq against the Iraqi people during the different wars, weapons that are also producing many carcinogenic diseases. You can imagine that after the falling of Saddam Hussein's regime, there was an increase by 20% to 300% the percentage of carcinogenic diseases. And it was because of the weapons used during the wars against Iraq. So this is one of the main problems that we're facing, and these problems are suffered also by Christians. And also Christians can be kidnapped at all times or assassinated. So in this case, many of them think about fleeing the country, especially youngsters. And we therefore were having a tremendous responsibility in order to provide to our people not only food and medicines and drugs, but we have to give them some hope for the future, because it is true that the aids that they receive, the subsidies, were necessary for a certain amount of time. When they were displayed, they needed food and they needed drugs. But now, when we are returning, we need to open for them some new doors in order to provide to them education, to provide to them health care, psychological help. And we need to be with them ever since they're children until they achieve maturity, so that when they grow old, they can rebuild their families following some healthy and correct criteria, with open-mindedness, far from fanaticism and violence, away from fanaticism and violence. That's what I would like to say, that humanitarian aid with food and drugs and other necessary things provided by the church or provided by NGOs is essential for a small amount of time, and it's been very helpful for us Christians in Iraq after the arrival of Daesh in our villages, Daesh and other similar organizations in the area. Because, of course, Christians have to flee their homes, have to run away. Their churches were destroyed, and they have to leave their homes with nothing with them, and they needed all kind of help. That humanitarian aid has been very helpful for us. Some of the Christians didn't have to leave the country, and they stayed there because they could find that type of humanitarian aid. But now we need to understand the ideology and the essence of fanatics and terrorists in order to fight them and in order to help Christians not to leave their land. So I insist what it is necessary is to work with children, with youngsters, in order to build the basis and the foundations of a consistent society that it is capable of recovering their social fabric so that we can all build the future of all of us, and to help children and youngsters to have a good education. But we also need to take practical steps. We need to take practical steps in order to achieve our objectives. According to the data that I've gathered in my visit 4 months ago, with interviews that I've made with many authorities from the Catholic Church and from other religions. I've traveled from Baghdad to Kurdistan to the north in order to cover this problem, the problem that children and youngsters are facing, and seeking for practical solutions, far from fanaticism and extremism, far from violence, so that we'll solve the problems as human beings and from the practical perspective. And when talking about children,
هنالك الكثير من المدارس رياض الأطفال حكومية
I
والخاصة
want to talk now about this part of society, children and youngsters. It is true that we're having many kindergartens and school, but I've not been able to see any program or any subject providing psychological support to children who are traumatized, and we know that we need psychologists supporting children in this type of situation, because I've seen that the main concern of the teachers and of the families is for children to become in the future doctors and engineers with a degree. But what if you're a doctor while maintaining a terrorist or a fanatic idea? So this is a total failure, and the government is failing in maintaining and keeping peace and safety on the area, and this means that children and youngsters continue on suffering. So we need to have enough psychologists giving support to children and youngsters at school, and for them to remain in contact with the families so that they can work together and take care of children and help families as well, so that they can heal their children and overcome the sequels of Daesh and other Islamist extremist ideas. Another thing is that it is important to build some specialized centers programming leisure activities and social activities for children and youngsters, so that they will have the opportunity or meeting one another, so that they can open themselves up to other cultures, to other children. Yesterday we heard when our Egyptian brother gave his testimony, he said that Muslim children, when they see Christian children, they have these fanatic thoughts. They're pointing at Christian children, and they point at them as if they were aliens. And this is because their families tell them to do so, and it is they are following the example set up by adults. But we have to fight those ideas. Maybe one thing that we can do is to reinforce the role that the church plays, so that we can work with families. I insist the religious rationale at the mosques with imams. They sometimes deny the presence of our as Christians, and they think that Christians are to be sacrificed. Some of them do. So the church needs to play a role in order to fight those ideas and to fight that rationale. Another thing that I wanted to say is, how can we play a real role to disseminate the ideas of peace with a moderate religious discourse so that the Islam will moderate their discourse as well? We have to reflect what's going on through our testimony so that extremists, Muslim extremists, will hear that we are just carrying our cross with courage.
صليب مخلصي يسوع المسيح.
Paul says that he carried the cross because that was the way of saving himself. Today, in Iraq, the government wants to pass some discriminatory laws saying that they are part of the Islamic code. For example, to marry underage children and not complying with children's law. Could you imagine marrying a 9-year-old girl? Some fanatics today in Iraq want to pass this type of Islamic laws that will allow for a 9-year-old girl to marry. And in that sense, I want to fight those ideas and I want to speak up clearly in order to fight this fanaticism. We're talking about children, we're talking about youngsters, and things are complicated, and we need to make more efforts because our government is doing no efforts to help children and youngsters. I've said that Daesh as a terrorist group is over, but its ideology remains there in our country, and we have to eliminate this ideology from the area, and we have to make sure that children forget about that ideology. Unfortunately, fanatics oblige many youngsters to flee the country, and those refugees are seen have gone out to the world. All the European public opinion have been very moved about the human tragedy of the refugees, and we want, instead of breaking walls, what we want to do is to build bridges that will unite youngsters who are suffering from unemployment that is suffered by many youngsters who have a university degree but cannot find a job, and they're also being assassinated, they're being kidnapped, they're being blackmailed, they're being killed. And many have probably seen on TV how these youngsters they try to flee, and they get into these boats to cross the sea and to run away from death in their countries.
And we know nowadays that if there isn't that war, it's true, there isn't that war, but there is still ideological extremism. So I've talked to many youngsters and many authorities, and they all agree in the fact that we need to find new work opportunities in Christian areas mainly. Those areas, some of them do enjoy a peaceful situation currently, but many think, and they say it bitterly, that I don't think that Iraq will never be as it was before. It means before all of the trauma it's been through. But I think that This is a proposal that could be feasible, that could be viable, if we help them get a job, and if we educate them, if we train them, if we give them the tools to eradicate extremism ideologies, then we will be following the right path. That way we can help the youngsters, and we also need to start organizing our camps for young people, for students, as we used to do in Iraq in the old days with Boy Scouts, for instance, because you know that if a young person survives a personal crisis or goes through a personal crisis, very often that young person could feel pushed to a bad decision, some bad options, negative options. So many of them become addicts, talking about alcoholics or drug addicts, depends. So we haven't seen that in the videos, but I can tell you that, well, what we haven't seen in front of the cameras is that in those same camps, there are people who are currently trafficking with drugs or are selling alcohol, and people are depressed. And they don't have enough training, enough education or self-awareness, and they are an easy prey to those traffickers. So we need to be very careful with those problems. And in the end, I would like to conclude by saying that if we want to build a society, a strong society, we need to give much importance to our youngsters and our children. And a wise man said that God will not provide the solutions to a nation that does not know how to protect its citizens. Thank you very much. Well, as you have explained the situation, and you've done it so well, explaining what the situation of children is in that area, in that region, I wanted now to ask you a question with regards to your personal experience, because I believe that it could be of interest for those of you following us. I think that you were the first priest who informed the Vatican that Daesh was coming and that they were coming with strength in 2014 during the invasion. How was that communication? Who did you call? Or how was it done? How did you send that first message? How did you ring the alarms so that the center of Christianism knew about it? In 2014, I was in Iraq before the arrival of Daesh. I was waiting for the ceremony to begin in order to be ordained as a priest. I was obviously studying, and I was studying celibacy and so on, and I was meeting with youngsters, with children in the area of Bartala and Karkash and all of those villages. But it was very difficult because from time to time I had to travel to Rome, so I had to be in between Iraq and Rome. And between visits, I would get to see that Iraq was no longer Iraq. I could not recognize my country, especially when I saw that many people started arriving with Afghans costumes, Afghan Mujahideens costumes, because I saw that in Iraq we were changing and we were going towards the precipice. And youngsters would ask me, "You're not from Iraq?" And I would say, yes, I am. But what I see is not Iraqi. Those people are not Iraqi. And sometimes they tell me, oh, you're not Iraqi, you don't recognize the reality. But I'm not Western. But the fact that I've gone out and then gone back has allowed me to see the difference and see the ideas that have entered the area. And I remember that when my mom got married, she was wearing a short skirt. My mom, in an Islamic country, there was that freedom, and women could wear those clothes. And in 1974, people wore those dresses and those clothes. But in the last few years, and now they wear veil, they wear hijab, and some people even wear burqas. And this is just new in the Iraqi society. And I always thought, why did that change come to happen in my country? Because I saw that my country was taking big steps backwards. Baghdad used to be the Middle Eastern Paris, and now I saw how my country, Baghdad, the city where I was born, was changing little by little towards that fanatism. So when I went back to Rome, I was the first person who would meet with the secretariat of the Holy Seat, and I explained to them the situation. And they said, Monsignor, I told Monsignor Ortega, this is what's happening in my country, what do I do? And he said, you have to write all of these things down in a report. And that was before Daesh actually arrived. And the arrival, Daesh's arrival, was something that was very much surprising to all of us because it happened so quickly. So I did write a letter to Pope Francis explaining the situation, and I asked to be a priest who could be blessed by him. I did not get an answer until March 23rd, 2018. On Holy Friday, that's when I got the news. Monsignor told me that the Pope asked twice for your name, and he wants to ordain you as a priest. He wants to give you the news. But obviously I was very surprised because I do not represent myself. What I represent is a whole group of youngsters, of children whose hands are empty. So my hope was to be ordained by the Pope in order to give some hope to those children, to those youngsters who had been forgotten and abandoned. So that day, and I say it, I want to say it here, my father is paralyzed. He has to use a wheelchair. So my father could not believe the situation. And when I invited him to come to Rome, to come to the ceremony, he said, I am a Christian Iraqi. I am not going to leave Iraq. I want to die as a Christian here in Iraq.
Tiempo. Estaríamos horas.
We would spend hours and hours and hours on end listening to your story, and we're really happy to have you had here, and we thank you for coming, and we wish you all the success with your work, your job, with the youngsters in Iraq. You have our support, and we will now give the floor to Mr. Antonio Velázquez.